I said, feel like part of this is a broken heart. And he just started crying. It's delivered without hope. You have this disease. There is no cure. The microbes in our body are 100 to 300 times more genetic information than the human genome.
Microbiome disruption can affect your brain's ability to store memory.
Anything you do out there is in here.
You're listening to the Wellness Evolution Community Podcast. I'm Dr. Christine Smith, and this is where your body becomes something you understand again. Because symptoms aren't failures, they're your body's most honest attempt to protect you. Each episode, we decode those patterns with root cause physiology, nervous system insight, and metaphors that make your biology feel alive, understandable, and trustworthy. You are smart. Your body is designed to heal. Let's remember how together. Welcome back to the Wellness Evolution Community Podcast. I have one of my most fascinating humans here, Martha Carlin, and I met her at multiple conferences, and we've just had some conversations around the idea that disease shows up out of nowhere. And so much of what we talk about is the body whispering for years before anybody gets a diagnosis. And this comes from digestion, sleep, stress, grief, the microbiome, the subtle nervous system, the glycocalyx, which I know you love talking about, and I'll love to dive into that, microbial teamwork, and how to just start hearing the body before it is screaming into some condition. So, hi, Martha. I would love if you could just share with everybody a little bit about your story and how you ended up with this incredible base of knowledge and this passion for helping people understand their body from the inside out.
Well, it actually started back in 2002. So my history, I was not, a scientist, a biologist, any of that. But in 2002, my 44-year-old healthy marathon running husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And I was like, okay, my background, trained as an accountant and a business operations person. I was taught as an auditor to never take anything at face value, examine the evidence for yourself. And so that really started this journey of me trying to examine the evidence. And in that process, the evidence is our life story. So I started through that process of trying to understand my husband's life story. And one of the first areas I really looked into was food. And from that kind of snowballed along looking at food and what we'd done to our food supply and all the chemicals on it and genetic engineering, starting to teach myself like what is genetic engineering? How does it work? What are the factors that could be affecting our genes? And then in 2014, I read Martin Blazer's book, which was just like a mind blower, called Missing Microbes. And I knew this connection from John and other people with Parkinson's, that they had had multiple strep infections as children, or many of them had taken antibiotics for acne in their teens. And so this sort of taking antibiotics and killing this thing called the microbiome, the trillions of bacteria, fungi, and viruses that function as our internal pharmacy. I was like, wow, okay, this is it. 6 months later, I quit my job and founded the Bio Collective and started collecting people's stool samples in a box and making them available for scientists all over the globe, and doing sequencing ourselves and building computational models to understand how the system works, and then just overlaying that on understanding my husband's story and other people with Parkinson's story. So yeah, I know a lot about microbes, but I also know a lot about how all of that plays into our life story. And that life story is often missing from the way we practice modern medicine.
That was so well said. And I didn't realize that you had done all that research just across the microbiome in general. Plus, you have the whole background of understanding like business flow and numbers and data. And I love when people with a whole body of knowledge come into a whole new body of knowledge and they get to blend them together. So this is just kind of a question I was thinking of as you were talking, but if you were to help people see microbes in comparison to like a ecosystem in the body and a business ecosystem and the reflection of those in each other, how would you describe it?
Well, so one of the things I was trained in was something called transaction flow review. And That's how you identify risk in a business. So you're basically drawing a map of everything that flows through the business, everyone who touches it, what they're supposed to do. And then you go through this inquiry process to see, are they actually doing what they're supposed to do? Are the people who are supposed to talk to each other talking to each other? Are, if this person's supposed to approve something, did they approve it? And so that kind of framework of thinking fits so perfectly into a microbial ecosystem, which is this network of flow and how all those pieces are working. And so that just naturally kind of overlaid and played into how I thought about microbes, not as single, it's a single microbe that's causing something, and thinking about how it plays in the teamwork of the whole ecosystem.
Let's just follow that thought train for a moment. How would you describe that to people, like the play of the whole ecosystem of this universe of the microbiome that lives inside of us that we are meant to have in a variety of pieces in a way that maybe they haven't seen yet because of everything you've studied?
Well, first of all, a huge epiphany for me is we're actually more microbial than we are human. So, some people may know that just in terms of cells, it's like 2 microbial cells to every 1 human cell. But
I heard
that's not,
someone say it's like the equivalent to or more than the number of stars in the Milky Way.
yes. But the bigger epiphany really is the genes and the function that comes from the microbiome.
Right.
So that is orders of magnitude more than our own genome. So we've spent all this time focusing on the human genome, but the microbes in our body that make up more of what we are actually are 100 to 300 times more genetic information and function than the human genome. So after learning that, really think about that as kind of the primary operating system.
Totally. I'm really loving where this is going. So if you were to, from your perspective, describe to people kind of the different roles of the different microbes in the ecosystem, how would you describe kind of the different characters at play?
Wow, that's kind of interesting. I mean, one of my favorite books, it's a little book that's out of print, but you can get it used. It's called The Life Bridge: The Way to Longevity with Probiotic Nutrients. And these beneficial bacteria that are, we have soil microbes, we have a lot that we find in fermented foods. Many of those are actually soil microbes. They're structure builders. They break things down. So, if you think about our food and we're trying to access minerals, the microbes actually make the inorganic minerals much more bioavailable for us to actually take them up. So like if you ate a rock, it would be very hard for you to absorb the minerals of the rock. But microbes break those minerals down and make them into complex compounds that make it easier for us to absorb and use in our body. And they're also building structures that are like mucus, which is what lines our gut. And then they're breaking down. A lot of microbes have the capability they've been out in the environment. So soil-based organisms have evolved in this kind of toxic soup from the beginning of time. And so they have lots of tools and capabilities to break things down, sometimes in a beneficial way, but sometimes the products of what they break down can actually cause a little bit more problems. And we're exposed to more and more of these kind of toxic things from our environment. And that actually selects for the ecosystem that we have in our body for microbes that can survive and deal with those situations.
That's fascinating to think about, that our microbiome might be developing and evolving faster than we are.
I mean, microbes, they can change very rapidly, where, the human genome is pretty slow from an evolutionary perspective. But if you think again that we're more microbial than human, that is our primary adaptive system. And that's what's signaling epigenetically to our genome.
Fascinating. So let's dive into talking about how everything we just discussed is now contributing to things like cognitive health. I think that is one of the topics that is really fascinating for people. And I know with your experience, you got so much firsthand research and just life experience. And I've gone through my own experience of seeing how different lifestyle factors can build up and accumulate and affect people. But I know you've dove deep into the research around the microbiome and things like Parkinson's. So I'd love your take on just what's happening with what we just talked about of like how the ecosystem is playing a role, and then how do things like Parkinson's or other cognitive decline develop in relation to this? So the gut-brain relationship.
Right. Well, there are so many pieces of that puzzle
Correct. Yes.
that tie back again to sort of total toxic burden. Somebody
Yeah.
asked me a few weeks ago, like, what do you think is the cause of Parkinson's after you've done all this research? And I said, I don't think there is a single cause. What I believe is, from looking at all of the pieces that I've been working on, is it's a total toxic burden. And so there are many environmental toxins, there are emotional toxins, and all of these actually select for a microbial population in our gut. And then that can actually create a loop because the gut and the brain are connected, tightly connected. I'm just reviewing again Emmerin Mayer's book, The Mind Gut Immune Connection. And I was listening to that in the car on the way down here yesterday and kind of seeing all these pieces again about how the gut and the brain communicate to each other. And you start having microbes produce these stress molecules that are sending signals to the brain, or the brain produces a stress molecule that is sending to the gut. And that is just a huge piece of the cognitive puzzle and the overall disease puzzle, because these neurotransmitters are so important to our ability to move memories into long-term memory.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. So microbiome disruption can affect your brain's ability to store memory. Wow. So I know there are so many different ways that we can go in this conversation of what we can talk about. And I think as we go through, maybe we can kind of continue defining like how different cognitive outcomes can come to be from the physiology processes of managing what you were just saying of the total toxic burden, or I often call it allostatic load, right? It's teaching people about the physical, mental, and chemical burdens on the body and how you only have so much room in your bucket to be able to handle all of that. And if you have a lot more mental stress, you are not going to be as physiologically resilient, and your chemistry is going to be less tolerant of things. Versus if you control your stress more effectively, you'll be more tolerant chemically. And this is why food sensitivities can be tied in when people go through big emotional experiences. And I know that's something that you address a lot in your work, is how the emotional experience can affect the microbiome. And like one of my favorite facts is when you're experiencing stress, you have microbes in your gut, like Yersinia and E. coli, that actually have receptors for your cortisol and your adrenaline and your epinephrine. And so it's like all of these can start to affect the microbial growth in your gut. And then people like Dr. Joe Dispenza have shown that just from meditation alone and coming to a state of peace and happiness, your microbiome can change with zero changes to your diet. And I find that fascinating in just like a week, right?
Yeah.
So just teaching people that there's so much to this, and maybe we can dive a little bit into endotoxins and then how you perceive the glycocalyx, because I feel like the toxic allostatic burden, that's probably the first place it affects, is the glycocalyx, which for anyone who's never heard of it, it's basically a lining of your cells, but she's going to explain it so much better. So I want to just let her talk about it.
Okay. Well, endotoxin has a surprisingly strong connection to Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and autism. Like if you went into the scientific literature and you just typed endotoxin and name a disease that has inflammation involved, and you will find dozens of animal model papers. There's over 500 papers on endotoxin and Parkinson's.
And these are the toxic byproducts of the bacteria she was talking about.
Yep. So the gram-negative bacteria, their cell wall is made of this lipopolysaccharide or endotoxin, and it's highly inflammatory. So as it goes through a cycle of growth and die-off, those cell wall membranes get into the system, and they're like cellular debris that goes into this glycocalyx. So what is the glycocalyx? It's a sugary coating that is around all of our cells. It lines the blood vessels. It lines the blood-brain barrier. It lines the gut. And it's made of, at the base level, it's made of hyaluronic acid. And, we saw in our aging data that the precursors in the microbiome for the production of hyaluronic acid are dropping as we age. And then it has these fuzzy little hairs, kind of like seaweed, coming off of that basement membrane. And those are made of sulfated polymers, chondroitin sulfate, heparin sulfate, and keratin sulfate. So it's sort of like your little seaweed. And through these, they're highly negatively charged, so they stand up. And then through those channels between them is where like oxygen and nitrogen bubbles go and CO2 bubbles come out. And it's basically deciding what gets in and what comes out. So can nutrients get in? Can cellular waste get out? And so it's very important. But when you start getting like pieces of debris, and I think it might have been Peter Attia or somebody called LPS endotoxin, little pieces of shit, like more ways than one, actually. But, that debris can get stuck in the glycocalyx and is very disruptive in its ability to shapeshift and is highly inflammatory. So wherever your weak spots, people have probably heard of leaky gut. So that's where these endotoxins are typically crossing over into the bloodstream. And then wherever you've got weak spots in your glycocalyx, whether that's your brain or your joints or some other part of your body, that's going to be kind of where you start to have issues first. And, what happens is over time, if you have weakened glycocalyx in one spot, it can start to spread. And so, we have in Parkinson's as an example, people who have slightly different presentations of disease or may not have dementia early, but get dementia later. There's something called Brock's hypothesis, which is a staging of, how it's moving through the body and the brain. And this is sort of that interface of the glycocalyx and the progressive damage of, the inability to propagate signal and make, have a coherent communication throughout the system. And so that, the same thing would hold true for Alzheimer's as well, in terms of, how that people can present with slightly different presentations of how the disease progresses, because a lot of it depends on what's happening in the overall system.
That's fascinating. So just to recap what she was just going over, because she's describing something very microscopic, but that involves your entire body. And so it's kind of this concept of you have this barrier, this coating to all of your cells that is protecting them from having the wrong things come in from the outside and making sure they get the right nutrients. And if that teeny tiny microscopic layer of molecular protection starts to break down, then that system is no longer protected. And that can happen in any kind of pattern depending on what happens in biology. But that is why we can have different presentations. But just the overall idea that like as your barriers start to break down, your function starts to break down. And this is what's happening in leaky gut, right? So when people start getting leaky gut, it is a mirror and a reflection of other things happening in their body, because the gut is a barrier. And then also you can think of the body as this kind of like quantum ocean computer. And so if the gut starts to break down, but it kind of moves through tides and it also has like an electrical grade component, then the same thing can happen within the cell, right? So it's like something bigger is a mirror of something smaller. And so then we start to think about mitochondria, which is also a bacterial relationship that makes all of our energy. And people don't know that when you've had leaky gut for a long time and your barriers are breaking down, your mitochondria start to break down. They don't function as well. But yeah, what do you want to add?
Well, one thing I would add to that was also an epiphany back to John's life story. He was a marathon runner. I mentioned that at the beginning. Well, endurance athletics are actually very damaging to the gut and into the electrical propagation, because, you're doing a couple of things there. So first, when you're on a very long endurance, either training run or an event, the blood supply moves away from the stomach the rest and digest. It moves out into your muscles. And then when you stop the event, it comes rushing back in. Well, so that's going to cause reperfusion injury in those tiny little capillaries that are, part of this whole system with the glycocalyx. And there's often a big inflammatory burst of endotoxin after an event like that. And then the other thing that you will often see is carb loading. In fact, there was a paper this week about somebody breaking the marathon time barrier and basically eating sugar the whole time, which is going to feed a certain profile of bacteria, many of which produce that endotoxin. And then you're also doing this sort of crazy electrolyte swing where you're putting huge electrolyte stress on the body, and then you're dumping, big swings of electrolytes into the body. And so, our body is constantly fighting to maintain homeostasis. So when we're dumping these extremes, whether it's trying to replenish electrolytes or, we're putting in sugar as fuel or, pulling the blood out. I mean, those three things together are really a recipe for some serious gut problems and long-term implications in an ecosystem if you are continuing to do that for a long period of time.
Well, it's the stacked effect without recovery that you're talking about. I had not thought about that injury of reperfusion when the blood comes rushing back in. That's fascinating because I'm a fan of like different kind of exercise or hot cold therapy or different things that challenge and stress your body, but your body has to be resourced for that. And I have seen in clinic and stuff like ultra marathon runners who have struggled with kidney problems because it's just really rough on your body. So allowing the body time to recover in between and knowing that if you are doing some kind of big athletic event, like basically treating yourself as if you have leaky gut is a really good approach. And like I'll work with leaky gut stuff on all my athletes because they're often pushing themselves or in weird temperatures or, taking their body to some kind of extreme. And it's great and fully an advocate of using your body and living your life, but also love your body in the process. And this is how we prevent things like cognitive decline later because you're protecting the glycocalyx and the whole system from breaking down.
Yeah. Well, so the other sort of circadian rhythm, which you touched on a little bit, and the hot cold, I've actually been giving this a little bit more thought lately in terms of when people do a cold plunge, because often people are doing it in the morning, and really you should be doing it at night and looking at the circadian rhythm of, the body's temperature. You want to bring the body's temperature down. What we do at night is naturally bring the body's temperature down. And I've been looking at it in terms of how that affects the glycocalyx, the warm temperature versus the hot temperature. There's a lot of things that happen at physiologic temperature of 37C or 98.6 versus when the body cools down. And in Parkinson's, there's quite a bit of evidence that the body is running about 2 degrees cooler. So it's trying to adjust for something. But the cold plunging, I think you want to support the body getting cool in the evening as you go into your rest phase and not in the morning, because that's when you want to fire up the heat.
Well, I will agree that I love helping people cool down in the evening. I'll remind them that like it depends on how you do your cold plunge. So if you just do like your face to get like a vagal activation in the evening, I think that's great. But if you're getting in and trying to do a 5-minute hold in the evening when it spikes all your cortisol, not as great. So I do like the cortisol activating cold plunges when people are going to do sports or it's in the morning or something like that. And then in the evening, they could do like splash your face with cold water or get like your chest in your face, and that'll activate the vagus nerve and cool the body. Or you can do like a hot bath. And then after you get out of the hot bath, your whole system cools down and like prepares for bed. So I remind people all the time that there's like different levels of using these therapies in different ways. And so just tuning into those as tools, because if they help to maintain the health of our cells over time, that is what matters the most for long-term health. And in all of this, because I know you've been researching this a bit, how do microplastics play a role in all of this as we're trying to navigate this very complex cellular mechanism?
Well, it's interesting. Again, microbes are the ultimate polymer chemists, and microplastics are actually polymers. So microbes can make plastics, and they can break them down. So, if we have a healthy microbiome, it can help us deal with and take care of that. There's a really interesting paper that came out, I think 2 weeks ago out of Korea, looking at kimchi and the Leuconostoc mesenteroides strain. And so we're actually in the process, we just did a genome comparison of our Leuconostoc mesenteroides to the one in the study. And, it has that same toolbox that enables essentially the binding of the plastics and the removal through the stool. But again, that goes back to you've got to be able to eliminate the waste from your body. And one of the primary ways of eliminating the waste and waste like plastics is going to be through your stool, much less so through your sweat. And it's going to put a lot of heavy load on your kidneys. So, I talk to people all the time about the importance of having a daily bowel movement and, more than one. I mean, we know that with our pets, if they haven't gone, there's probably something wrong, but we don't translate that to our own. And a lot of doctors don't. They're like, oh, it's normal if you go every 2 or 3 days. No, it's not, because that waste is sitting there. That endotoxin is sitting there. Bile acids, estrogens, all of that stuff is recycling if it's sitting in your body. And so you're putting just a toxic load on the entire system.
Absolutely. So, way that we're talking about this load for anybody listening is just this understanding of everything that you have coming from the environment. So, all of the weird estrogens from the scented deodorant and that, plug-in and the candle and the perfume of the person that just walked by you and everything from the road and everything in agriculture that's being sprayed on our food, what somebody else washed our food with before it even got to us. And then taking in these microplastics from the water, or the fact that like our water has so many pharmaceuticals in it now, or just weird things like that, which is why like some of the easiest things you can do for yourself is like an air filter and a water filter, right? And then just like buying the right products. We could have a whole other podcast about that.
Yeah.
But just as you're become aware of these things, which I think people's awareness has really only been brought to it in the way that it needs to in the last couple of years, but this has been happening for a few decades and we're finally like realizing the effects. This is how we can start to protect our long-term health. And then at some point here, we're going to dive into the emotional side of all of this and managing your emotions with this, but having some empathy that like when you're dealing with this many environmental toxins, it does decrease your emotional resiliency. But I know one of the other things you talk about is like glyphosate from the environment, right? And that is just one of our weird agricultural practices that we have in place of spraying poison all over our food that we're trying to change. But as people are navigating all of this together, where do you want them to direct their attention, most importantly, of things they can do in their environment? Because I know you talk about these a lot.
Well, I do. So I do a lot of education on our customer base. We do something called the BiotiQuest Learning Lab. But sometimes it can be overwhelming because I bring in environmental experts or, people who've been dealing or helping in one area or another or have deeper knowledge. And it can sometimes be overwhelming, but what I try to do is say there are some simple things that you can do. And also, the importance of caring for your microbes, because they are a primary system of detoxification and support for you. So you've got to kind of have a microbiome first thought process around the food that you're eating. You're not just feeding yourself, you're feeding your microbes, and you want to feed the right kind of microbes. Water, you mentioned that. The filtration of water is really important because our water systems were designed 100 years ago to remove bacteria and viruses from the water, but not all these chemicals now that come through. So, we're getting our neighbors, leftover drugs that they're peeing out into the toilet and a lot more things. And so, but filtration takes out everything. So it's taking out your minerals. And, that also ties in with glyphosate because glyphosate is a minerals chelator. So our food is not as nutrient dense because of glyphosate broadly in the environment because it's binding up those minerals we need. And then, we're getting a lot of this residue in our, or, when we when we filter our water, we're not getting minerals. So you've got to add back minerals to your water if you're filtering. So you want to filter, you want to add back minerals, and, just being mindful of what you're eating. That is
Where it lived and where it came from.
where it lived, where it came from. I talk to people a lot about getting involved in your local food systems. Food is information. It's information about where you are in the world. And that is giving you information about the light, the environmental stressors. All of that comes in information from the food. I mean, genetics are information. The plants are made of the same, 4 genes that we're made of, that the bugs are made of, everything. And so this is all information flowing through us. And the microbiome is kind of that translator. But if you go to your local farmer's market or find a farmer that you can, join a CSA, community supported agriculture, then you can really ask questions like, how do you grow this food? What sort of chemicals? Are you using chemicals? Are you not using chemicals? And you get a better sense and relationship with the person who's producing your food. And I really think we need to get into a stronger community supported agriculture again and move away from these large scale. I mean, 50% of the produce in America comes from the Central Valley of California. And that Central Valley of California is known as Parkinson's Alley because of all the chemicals that are used in the growing of produce in California.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I had a client who was in the agricultural industry out there and ended up with a lymphoma of types. And it's just,
Yeah.
it is amazing the effect that chemistry has on our body, but it's not to freak you guys out, right? Like, we're making you aware of this because you can heal from it. And so many people do. And it's just like, if you know where stuff is coming from and you can stop your exposure and then give your body the things that it needs to clear it, then your body usually can. But I find what you're talking about so fascinating, right? Because we're talking about like agriculture and what's happened to the soil and the mineral chelators and like changing the mineral environment, which changes the microbe environment, and a whole bunch of stuff in the soil and our food. And then how that changes the microbes in our gut, and then how that starts to change the environment as a whole. But I'd love just kind of your reflection on how, like, the parallel between the damaged soil and a damaged gut.
I mean, the soil and the gut, very, very similar. They're both kind of colloid factories. And early on, when I started working with Raul on our probiotic formulas, and one of our main formulas actually does break down glyphosate. But I said to him, Raul, if we don't go all the way downstream and look at the soil and try to solve that problem too, we're kind of pushing a string up a hill. And Raul's background was, he was actually one of the pioneers in using microbes to clean up oil spills. And so we took that same concept and we built a 8-strain consortium of bacteria to break down glyphosate and atrazine and these hydrocarbons in the soil to restore plant vitality and, mineral density, nutrition, increase yield, do all of that. And that was about, I want to say like 8 or 9 years ago. And we now have like all this data in 20 different crops of how those microbes are making a difference from, wine and grapes to cotton to, corn, soy, vegetables, alfalfa, just name something. Microbes are just incredibly amazing. But if we don't think about the way we're looking at and treating our gut bacteria, think the same way about our soil bacteria, this is a giant interconnected system. You cannot think of these things as separate. I think back in 2019, I did a conference called Reimagining Human Health. And one of the things I said is like, it's all these little choices we make. We think, it's just a little bit of antibiotic, or it's just a little bit of this, and it's out there, and it's not out there. Anything you do out there is in here. And so that whole interconnected web and how we think about, I did a talk at Acres in December, and I changed the title of my talk to Choose Life, because we've had this culture of killing the weed, killing the microbe, everything's bad, negative, negative, negative. And we need to think of these as ecosystems, and how are we going to support the, flourishing ecosystem that keeps things in balance.
That's such a good answer. Let's dive in a little bit to what you have been studying and research and developing as whatever products you want to talk about, but like the microbial strains that you think you wish people knew about, or just what you wish people knew of what you're working on.
Well, I mean, the Leuconostoc mesenteroides, I think is, it's one of these incredible microbes that is, if you look in that little book I was talking about, the Life Bridge, it is found universally almost in fermented foods around the globe. So it's that microbe that comes in first and sets up the acidic environment that knocks those pathogens out. Like in Parkinson's, we see some things going on with pH, and the pH being too high, too alkaline. So a microbe like that sets a pH up. The stomach's supposed to be very acidic, and that's the front line of where all those pathogens get killed. And so that microbe then sets it up for a lot of these other lactobacillus to come in and produce your B vitamins and, sort of shape the whole ecosystem. And it's also something called an exopolysaccharide producer, which, that's a fancy word for something that's kind of like mucus. And so it's building part of that protective layer. So, and you don't find that in very many probiotics. So we have our own strain that we brought all the way through into the market, and it came from some sauerkraut, actually, from cabbage that I grew in my garden like 7 years before I ever started the Biocollective. And I had stored it for a long time. And, we did the work out of that. So I think that's an incredible microbe that very few people talk about, but, is really one of the workhorses of fermented foods. And also kefir. It's in kefir.
Interesting. So I guess as people come to this place of trying to balance their microbiome, I know sometimes I'll talk to people about there's a time for probiotics and sometimes there's a time to wait on probiotics, like if you're really tender and irritated. And because the way that they work when they're coming into the gut to turn over the rainforest is basically kind of kicking the bad guys out of their place and taking their place. But that can create some kerfluffle in the tissues and the immune system. So what's your opinion for people on when they're wanting to help their microbiome, but say going from the stage of being super sensitive to anything because it's been so disrupted for a while to getting to a stage of being able to robustly handle whatever food again?
Yeah. Well, I'll often recommend that people, I hate to recommend restrictive diets, but I think sometimes in order to heal the gut so that you can start to restore things.
I call them focused experiments instead of restrictive diets. You're focused experimenting on what works for you.
But, the GAPS diet, which is, a lot of your bone broth, which has that hyaluronic acid that is feeding the glycocalyx. I think that's a big underappreciated piece of how that focused experiment works. And you're taking away the fermentable fibers that feed some of the pathogens as well. But, moving away from sugars, glucose and fructose. And we actually produce fructose in our body when we're under stress. So I'll have a lot of people say, so our best-selling product is a product called Sugar Shift, which I actually made for my husband, John, to convert sugars, glucose and fructose, into mannitol, which we don't use, but it's a free radical scavenger. It also depletes deuterium in the process, if anybody's a deuterium person. And so you're removing those sugars, so they're not feeding those pathogens in the upper GI tract. But even with that, if somebody is super sensitive, they may need to take some action steps before they can add something like that in, because the transition process is just, too uncomfortable for some people. And you're reshaping an ecosystem that you've spent, 20, 30, 40 years putting in place.
I remind people it's much like a garden or the soil that we were talking about, right? Like if you want to till the soil and like get all the stuff out of the way, you have to have soil to till. So if your gut is just a big raw red thing that is allergic to everything, bone broth might be your friend before you're trying to like host a battleground. And so doing that for a while until you're less sensitive, and then you can start experimenting with like starting to turn over the rainforest. And there's different strains of microbes, right? So you can have silent strains that are a little gentler and they don't stimulate the immune system as much and they produce more antioxidants. And then you can move into the strains that start to actually retrain your immune system after you like go through something weird. Like my immune system got strange after I got mold poisoning, and then using the right probiotics is how I kind of turned it back on so it was functioning again. So there's so many ways that we can affect ourselves with the teamwork of these different microbes. And I guess like before I go into the emotional component that we wanted to talk about as well, any last thoughts on the kind of microbial teamwork that you wish people knew?
Well, so that's actually how we kind of put our mindset in place. Is we were looking at all this data from the soil, from the stool, the stool microbiomes and functions that people lost. Well, it's like having a factory. Like one worker in your factory, if they all have the same skill, is not going to produce the car you want to produce. So we looked at it and used computational modeling to put together teams that could actually do the work to put back a system that you're missing or may not be functioning optimally. So, we put together a team to help support, for example, for sleep. We have one called Simple Slumber. It helps support tryptophan production and bacterial melatonin. People maybe don't realize that bacteria make melatonin, and bacteria have a circadian cycle.
So for all these people taking all the melatonin, there's a probiotic they can check out.
Yes. And just from customers who've been long-term melatonin people, they actually have found that it works better for them than melatonin. We have one called Perfect Peace that we just brought out in the fall for anxiety. It's, balancing those neurotransmitters, and you can actually see the results of that on I think the Whoop is what we have right now, the data in the stress score in about 20 minutes. I mean, I can feel it when I take it. If I'm a little bit too edgy or just kind of agitated and I take it in 15 or 20 minutes, sort of the edge comes off. But the one I think that is really underappreciated, I made actually for one of my advisors whose mom she was in her 80s. She had to have her appendix removed. And then she got an infection and was on IV antibiotics for about 2 months. Her gut was just a mess. And, the doctor's like, oh, that's kind of the way it's going to be. It'll eventually settle back out. And she just wasn't going to settle for that. And we had modeled one in our system after a study came out of Weitzman that was showing that this one probiotic was actually bad after taking antibiotics. And, working with Raul, he said, well, I can see why, because it's making the gut too acidic. You've got to put in a balanced cast of characters. And so we came up with this formula, prototyped it for Steve's mom, and she had incredible results. And so I'm working with some dentists, because dentists are some of the biggest prescribers of antibiotics when they're doing a lot of this dental work, to, if you're going to give somebody antibiotics, like put back a team to restore what you're disrupting so that things can move forward. And then we have one for the immune system called Ideal Immunity, and it has a particular strain called Lactobacillus ruminus that prevents pathogens based on some research on a similar strain in Europe from attaching to cells, so attaching to that glycocalyx. And it's really effective at all your foodborne pathogens, Listeria, Salmonella, E. coli, all of that. So, we recommend people take that if they're going on foreign travel or if they get food poisoning or, any of those kinds of things. But we're looking at all of these as putting in a team that supports each other. Because like putting in a single strain, it's like if you tried to just plant a tree that was non-native into a forest, it's probably not going to flourish very well. But these teams go in and they're cross-feeding each other, and one microbe's waste is an input for another, and that's how the ecosystems work in the real world.
Well, I think people forget that bacteria even do what's called like quorum sensing, right? Where it's like they actually can essentially energetically sense what's happening in the rest of the
Yeah.
colony. So it's like they need friends. They need
Yeah.
friends. It's a community. So in your research of all these tools, which sound amazing, and if people wanted to check these out, where would you direct them?
So our website is biotiquest.com, BIOTIQUEST.com.
Okay, great. So then they can kind of go, they can check out these different strains that have been researched for these different things. Because it's not like you like fix your gut once with this giant probiotic course and then you're done. It's just kind of this thing that you maintain over time and you choose what you want to consume based on what you want to design in the gut.
Right.
Beautiful. So in your research of all these different strains and everything that you're putting together, what brought you into the conversation of emotions playing a role in all of it?
Well, so early on, I actually came across the work of Dr. Mark Light, who was a pioneer in something called microbial endocrinology.
Oh, cool.
And it was like, I mean, this was back 2015, I think I found his work really fascinating. And then he ended up connecting with John Cryan and Ted Dinan from University College Cork, who had been doing a lot of mental health work with microbes and the microbiome in mice and making these connections to, the gut brain and how these neurotransmitters are going both ways. So that was kind of a huge epiphany for me, is like, okay, microbes are really shaping and helping us deal with emotions or not deal with emotions. But really where it came home for me is in the last 2 years, I started working with the Resolve Parkinson's Foundation, and we started working on a docuseries, just talking to people with Parkinson's and saying, tell us your story. You remember back at the beginning, I said the story is a big part of what's going on. And our current medical system doesn't have a framework to pay somebody to listen to your story or to think about and connect all those dots. Well, so we did one-on-one interviews with about 20, probably 25 people. And then we did some group interviews for a total of about 35 people. And it was really a huge epiphany for me in hearing people's stories, this connection to either a major loss. It could be, death of a parent. It could be loss of a job, loss of a business, loss of a child, a major illness with a child, these traumatic events, either in close proximity or not even necessarily close proximity or even over a lifetime, but this, stressor mechanism that where they were holding in emotions, not dealing with them. And in particular, we found with a number of the men, as we were talking to them about it and saying, we're seeing this thing. One interview in particular, in talking to this gentleman, I said, after I've talked to so many people, I feel like part of this is a broken heart. And he just started crying. And I'm like, there's such a huge piece of who we are that we're not recognizing. We've got so much information coming at us and so many things to distract us from ourselves and what we're holding inside. And so that was a big piece of it. And another piece of it was like self-judgment, I would say, those self-talk. And, I talk about this a bit in, my book that's coming up that sort of tells this whole journey. And I have a chapter in there called Words Matter. And, when we were little kids, we're taught sticks and stones can break your bones, but words can never hurt you. That is absolutely not true. And that, we have these patterns from childhood and all the way up, but you walk into a doctor's office and they diagnose you with words that they put upon you, and people take on that identity.
It is one of my biggest irritations with the conventional system. I don't know. It's tricky because I know we need diagnoses for the sake of communication, but it's just the way that it's presented, where it's exactly what you said. People start identifying with the disease. And this is why I try so hard to teach physiology, is because I'm like, no, your body is going through a phase. It is in a state. It is in a physiological state. What do we need to do to shift the physiological state in the direction that you want to go? And that might be removing something in the way, or it might be providing a resource. Now, if it has been in that state for too long and accumulated, then it becomes harder and harder and harder to go in a different direction. But I truly believe that no matter what itis you've been diagnosed with, it is a very similar mechanism of healing the whole.
Right. Absolutely. And I think the way in Parkinson's in particular, but I think this falls into a lot of disease categories, is it's delivered without hope. And
Yes.
in the allopathic model, it's like, okay, you have this disease. There is no cure. It is progressive neurological. There's nothing you can do. And that's not true. And so I have spent, the last 20 years deeply looking to understand there's a lot you can do. There's a lot you can do with exercise and lifestyle choices and cleaning up your environment and working on your mental state and stress management. There are all of those pieces and layers together are actionable things that can have a huge difference in how you experience your life. And we saw that very much with John. He lived a very vital, exciting, adventurous life until he got COVID. And, COVID is another one of those things where this debris gets into the glycocalyx. And if you've got a weakened glycocalyx, it can cascade into worse problems. And, I lost him from a pulmonary embolism in September of 2024.
Well, your work is continuing to help many people, and I'm sure he'd be incredibly proud. So if someone is hearing themselves in this, what would you direct them to prioritize right now?
Prioritize yourself.
Good answer.
Prioritize yourself. And that is a pattern I see too, is they haven't prioritized themselves.
Yeah.
So you've got to take a step back, think about yourself as a whole person, and start to really look at what these contributors have been and the action you can take. But I think the voices in your head and the things you're saying to yourself, that mental image that you're creating with the words you're saying, that's where you can have a huge shift. And like you were saying, just with the meditation, that shifts your microbiome, that shifts the state of your nervous system, that shifts everything.
Yeah. And many studies have shown it to be as effective as a steroid. So there's so many cool components of this. And I guess as we kind of wrap everything together, if there was one piece of knowledge that you wanted to leave people with that you just thought was important, or could be your favorite cellular mechanism, or something around everything we've been discussing today, like what is a big favorite thought you'd want to leave people with?
Well, this might be a little too nerdy, but back to that glycocalyx, it's what's going on at the interfaces. So, people think about cells as these little circles that they've seen on a page, and that's not what we are. We are a continuous, flexible structure that is constantly moving and changing. And so if you start to think about that structure and how we support adaptability and flexibility in the structures at the interfaces, and that's, interfaces, an oil and water in the body, or interfaces with food in the gut as it's traveling through, or even interfaces with how we deal with each other. All the action is happening at those interfaces, and we want coherence in the interface.
I've been thinking of it as you've been talking about it as this like transducer of life force across our cells.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. And I also know for anybody who wanted to learn more, you have a couple books, and just where would you direct them to if they wanted to learn more about you or what you've written or what you're working on?
So the book that is out today is called My Search for the Perfect Poop, which is a lot of stories about how your stool is talking to you. And it has funny stories and serious stories alike, but it's a short book. It's on Amazon. You can find it there. The other book that is coming out June 23rd, but is available on pre-sale on Barnes & Noble, and the ebook is available on Amazon right now. That is called Connected: Love, Loss, and the Unseen Forces Behind Chronic Disease. And that's really a lot of these pieces, both seen and unseen, that people haven't connected and thought about. And it's also about the connection between people and the people who show up to help you. And so those are two great resources if you want to know more about the story. I also have a Substack and a blog called Martha's Quest, where I write about environmental factors and Parkinson's and the microbiome. And then, of course, Biotic Quest, where you can find the products that we make. And then if you're a farmer or you know a farmer, our Ancient Organics Bioscience is where those soil products can be found.
Amazing. Fantastic resources for people. So thank you. And I could talk to you for a whole nother day about the emotional effects on the microbiome. So perhaps we can do another one in person and dive deeper into that.
That would be great.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here and taking the time. And for anybody who's listening, please write questions in the comments and we will answer your questions. And if we do another one, we can integrate it. So write with what you're curious about, write with what you liked, write with what you want to know more about, and we can integrate it. So thank you so much, Martha. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, Christine.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you for being here and reclaiming your health sovereignty. If you feel ready for deeper guidance and reconnecting to your inner intelligence and finally not going the journey alone, I created the Wellness Evolution community for that exact purpose. For you. It is a place rooted in education, foundational physiology, and community support where you can learn to trust your body again. Visit www.wellnessevolutioncommunity.com for a free quiz to find out where your body is at in your healing stages.